And she teaches courses on American Jewish and Holocaust literature. In addition to over 90 scholarly articles and book chapters, and I've gone through her CV, it is many, many, many pages and very extensive and fascinating. She's also the author or editor of 11 books, including most recently, Holocaust Graphic Narratives, Generation, Trauma, and Memory, published last year. And I anticipate we'll be learning and hearing a lot about that book today. Also, the Palgrave Handbook of Holocaust Literature and Culture, published from Palgrave Publishing in 2020 as well. Dr. Ahrens is on the editorial board of Philip Roth Studies, Studies in American Jewish Literature, and Women in Judaism. And she's a series editor for Lexington Studies in Jewish Literature as well. She's a professor at Trinity from San Antonio. And Dr. Ahrens, welcome. We are so grateful that you're here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to share the screen because there's some images I wanted to show. Okay, you can all see that? Okay, good. Maybe I should just give a little background about my interest and research and teaching. So my area, as David said, is American Jewish and Holocaust studies. And increasingly, I've been interested in how we talk about the Holocaust now, how we talk about the Holocaust in the 21st century, how we talk about the Holocaust at a time that will see the end of direct survivor testimony. And in terms of my own work, I started by writing on, looking at the literature of Holocaust survivors. And I'm interested in the intergenerational transmission of memory. And so my work has taken me from survivor writing to second generation, the children of survivors, and now to third generation, the grandchildren of survivors who have come of literary age and are producing just a wealth of literature, memoirs, poetry, short stories, novels, and most recently, graphic novels, which I think is a genre that really speaks to something in our time. And that's what I sort of want to talk about. How the question that I keep coming back to is, how is memory transmitted by the second and third generation? It's a memory that is not their own. It's a kind of borrowed memory, secondhand, third-hand memory. So how do we transmit the narratives of the past? And not only transmit the narratives of the past, but how do we continue to make them relevant to a post-Holocaust generation? As the third generation novelist, Daniel Mendelsohn, whom I'm sure many of you have read, The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, acknowledges, I am a fervent believer, he says, in the necessity of carrying over the testimony to future generations. But I think the pressing question is, what does it mean to be the transmitter of another's stories, another's past? How are subsequent generations able to navigate and mediate the memory of the Holocaust? And to do so in an ethical way, and being responsible for the facts of history. What are the contemporary forms of Holocaust expression and representation? As the novelist Joseph Skybell, who wrote Blessings on the Moon, he's a third generation writer as well, writes, if you don't tell that story, it disappears. And I think that that's a very real danger that we should take very seriously. So the direction, right before moving to the work I've done on graphic narratives, I have a couple of books out on third generation Holocaust writing. And that kind of took me into the form of the graphic novel. And it was a new direction for me. And I have found a rich and compelling genre for the complex expression of history and individual histories. And one thing that characterizes third generation writing, that characterizes the writing of the grandchildren, whether it's in graphic form or more traditional genres of novels and short story, is the desire to get to the unique features of individual family narratives. And you see this, it's a kind of repetition with the third generation who are at a point, this is a generation that grew up knowing the facts of Holocaust history. Many of them, most of them, took Holocaust classes in school. They are familiar with Holocaust film, with the general picture, who did what, when, and where. But what they don't know and what they are trying to get to are individual family narratives. And this is something, as I say, that characterizes the third generation. So I've been very, very interested in this. And since the turn of the 21st century, we have found a burgeoning, not only of literature by the third generation, but graphic narratives, illustrated accounts. And what we find in this necessity to unearth the stories of individual lives, there's a concern about abstractions as we move farther and farther from the defining events of the Holocaust. It's one thing, as I say, to know the overarching historical narrative, the big picture, the legislated machinery of National Socialism and the effect on 6 million. It's another thing to find out the individualized particulars of personal and distinct family histories and family narratives, especially at a time, as I say, that we'll see the end of direct survivor testimony. And I'm thinking of a writer such as the novelist Rachel Kadish. She wrote, among other works, the novel From a Sealed Room. And she acknowledges, I dredge lessons learned in Hebrew school. We will remember the 6 million. We will preserve the memories. In our hearts, we keep them alive. I shake my head with confusion. How pallid, how insulting these phrases seem. Always remember, never forget, the Hebrew school teachers urged us. I want to ask them, what can that possibly mean? And Daniel Mendelsohn, too, writes, we're up against the limits of the mind. 6 million is an unimaginable number. You don't grasp it. The mind needs contours that it can imagine. As another third generation writer, Jonathan Safran Foer, who wrote in the novel Everything is Illuminated, the origin of a story is always an absence. The origin of a story is always an absence. And that's something that I'm really interested in. How do we create both absence and presence? And I think that one way we do this is through the graphic novel, because one of the central questions is, how do you enact? How do you create? How do you recreate? How do you represent the enormity, the devastation of the Holocaust, the sheer scale of the catastrophe, and at the same time evoke singular family loss? The very immensity, momentum, and enormity of the Holocaust challenges in many ways conventional forms of expression and traditional telling, calling upon writers to seek alternative structures of representation in an attempt to approximate and extend the scope of the trauma of the Holocaust and its memory. And there's so many graphic novels and graphic memoirs and graphic narratives and graphic short stories that have appeared, as I say, since the opening decades of the 21st century. And my interest, and this is what I wanted to just give you some examples of today, my interest is in the, as I said, in the intergenerational transmission. So what I thought I would talk about 3 graphic narratives, one written by a child survivor, another written by the son of a survivor, and the third by a granddaughter of a survivor, all in an attempt to draw memory onto the page, to draw and narrate memory. And this is what I have worked on in the book I recently published on Holocaust graphic narratives. And the image on this, I don't have time to talk about this writer, but there's a fascinating graphic narrative written by a Canadian cartoonist, Bernice Eisenstein, titled, and this is where this image comes from, "I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors." And I certainly recommend that. And at the end, if we have time and you'd like some recommendations for second and third generation writing that's very new, I'm happy to talk about that. But so I wanted to begin with what I think is a fascinating work. It's by Miriam Caton, the graphic memoir titled "We Are on Our Own." It was published in 2006. And it's the story of her experience as a child in Hungary during the Nazi invasion. And the narrative is told from 2 competing and often conflicting perspectives. The limited vantage point of a young child survivor. Caton was only 2 years old at the time of the German invasion of Budapest. And that of her mother, whose memories are mediated through her daughter's illustrated articulation of them. And of course, that's what we find in second and third generation writing, a kind of mediated memory. I mean, I think you could argue that all memory is mediated, right? Even for someone who was a direct eyewitness, time, experience, shifting perspectives always has a bearing on what we remember and how we remember. But this text is so interesting because she was there. Miriam Caton was there in hiding in the countryside in Hungary with her mother. But of course, her memories are clouded by the fact that she was so young. But in any event, We Are on Our Own, through this interplay of text and image, mediates these differing layered perspectives. And it's only through the hindsight born of age and experience that Caton, as an adult with a child of her own, can belatedly recover and attempt to articulate the events she was subjected to as a child, as well as the approximate emotions and sensations of an experience that she now only obliquely, guided by her mother's stories, remembers. And Caton is an animator and graphic artist, and she worked for a long time, for years, in Israel. After the war, the family went to Israel, but eventually to the United States, where she lives in New York now. But she came to this project late in life, drawing her first memoir. She's done 2. Her second one, so We Are on Our Own, is the first one. The second one is called Letting It Go. And what she finds in Letting It Go is her own child wants to marry a German citizen from Berlin and move to Berlin. And it's about the trauma that Miriam Caton goes through in accepting this and learning to accept it. But anyway, this one, she drew when she was in her 60s. She's now in her late 70s. And commenting on the belated origins of her attempt to draw the narrative of the past, Caton explained in an interview, "The stories my mother told me about our life and survival during World War II and the fate of our family were always with me, a daily, uninvited and unwanted presence. They begged to be told, but I thought, who needs another Holocaust book anyway? However, when I discovered for myself the world of comics, I realized I can draw these stories." So beginning in Budapest in 1944, her story narrates a life ruptured by the Nazi occupation of Hungary. In graphic form, Caton draws the abrupt and devastating reversal of her family's condition. The Nazi onslaught, the legislated rise of overt anti-Semitism, her father's enlistment in the Hungarian army, and their displacement from home and community. Disguised as Hungarian peasants, a village girl with an illegitimate child, mother and daughter alone navigate on foot through the Hungarian countryside, taking precarious and itinerant refuge where they can. One thing about this image, this is an early image in the book that I think is so important, is just in graphic form, she shows the closing in of their world. It's a scene taken from inside their apartment. They're looking outside. Mother and daughter are looking outside. And as the Nazi flag with the swastika comes and encloses them in the darkness. And what we find throughout the graphic narrative, most of it is in black and white or these sepia tones. But what we find here is this sense of absolute isolation, and it's really drawn these swirls of confusion, their anonymity. You can't make out their faces. Represents, I think, the individual, but also the collective experience of abandonment and desperation. Moving from one temporary shelter to another, motivated by the predatory pursuit of those who would hunt them down. Theirs becomes a life circumscribed by flight, by disguise and concealment. And these are recurring tropes in the literature of the Holocaust, and by the imminent danger of exposure. And the images that Caton draws make emphatic the blurring of perspectives, but also the limitations of memory. Her illustrations are characteristically softly drawn sketches, and as the narrative progresses and the danger increases, the drawings become increasingly blurred and jarring. And thus the images reflect both the indistinctness of memory and those moments of trauma replayed, because, and this is always a question for Holocaust representation, whether it's in graphic form or some kind, or a traditional novel or traditional narrative prose, or in this hybrid form of text and image, is how do you draw, how do you represent trauma? How do you represent memory? And so we see this blurring of both vision and memory in the graphic depiction of mother and child in flight, at the mercy of both human malice and the malign indifference of the natural world. And I want to stop here a minute, because another recurring trope in Holocaust literature is the complicity of the natural world. And Elie Wiesel, in all of his works, but I'm thinking maybe something like Night, that the very descriptions of the physical landscape, day turned to night, that the natural world is made complicit with Nazism, which of course is deeply disturbing. But here we see mother and child existing on these muddied and distinct borders of shelter, emphasized by the shadowy and blurred images of mother and child traversing their way through a hostile landscape. And this series of panels, I think, is really important. There's minimal accompanying text. In the first of the panels at the top left of the page, the mother and child set off, initially followed by a stray dog that captures the interest of the young child, chasing them as if in play. Contrasting their two radically different perspectives, the child looks back over her mother's shoulder at the playful dog, while Caton's mother is trudging with the child in her arms. And you can see the wind pushing against her as she holds her daughter against her shoulder with one arm while dragging her suitcase in her other hand. In the second panel at the top right of the page, Caton's mother has fallen to her knees as she makes a sled of their suitcase in order to pull her child, too heavy to carry, against the dragging blizzard of the storm. The dog, tail wagging, sniffing the child's hand as she reaches for him. The third panel, in the center of the page, in which the child's attention is riveted behind them on the dog that's receding into the background, she's shown waving her hand, either in departure or beseeching him. Like the first panel, this panel abandons all text, a representation of the silence that encases them, words we're meant to understand that require too much energy to speak. The final image and the largest panel at the bottom of the page depicts mother and child almost obscured by the gales of wind against which Caton's mother's bent in the direction of their uncertain, arduous journey. Now, her mother's gaze, interestingly, is directed ahead as she forges through the storm, but it's also directed off the panel. We don't know where they're going. They don't know where they're going. And the scene here becomes increasingly erratic. And I think what we show is Caton, this kind of desperation and exhaustion. And that Caton, as a child survivor, does and does not remember the events with any sense of wholeness, but she does remember her mother's fear and her mother's disorientation, a kind of felt remembrance. And I think, too, what's important is that we see her moving off of the page. Is she going to find danger, increased danger? What's she going to meet there? She doesn't know, we don't know. And I think what this also speaks to is Caton's appreciation for her mother's ingenuity. She would not have been saved without her mother. I now want to move to a second generation narrative. A writer, Martin Lemmelman, who's the child of survivors and who grew up with, as the second generation does, the stories of their parents. As another second generation writer, Eva Hoffman, suggests, the guardianship of the Holocaust has been bequeathed to the children of survivors. The legacy of the Shoah, Hoffman writes, is being passed on to us. The inheritance is being placed in our hands, perhaps in our trust. And I want to talk about this one example of second generation text, Martin Lemmelman. It's a graphic depiction, and Martin Lemmelman lives in Florida now. He's written another graphic novel that followed this. He grew up in Brooklyn, and it's about the shop, the grocery store that his father ran and that he and his brother grew up in Brooklyn. He now lives in Florida, but this is the graphic depiction of his mother's experiences in hiding during the Nazi occupation of Poland. Mendel's daughter, and this too was published in 2006. In this second generation graphic narrative, Lemmelman attempts to recreate his mother's past, her pre-war life in Poland, the murder of her parents by the Nazis, her escape and concealment in a hole dug in the forest, a grave she inhabited with her sister and two brothers, and the deportation and death of members of her extended family. The narrative that Lemmelman reconstructs is the story told to him by his mother that she had initially recorded on videotape as part of the survivors' oral history project. And as Lemmelman writes, the videotape was recorded in 1989. He didn't come upon this videotape until right around the turn of the 21st century. It was in with other tapes, and it was after his mother's death that he found it. And you get this sense with the second generation, the sense of belatedness, of coming to the stories too late. And there's a kind of fraught sense of anxiety about that. But so Lemmelman's story is the legacy passed down to the son of survivors, establishing a kind of generational continuity set against generational disruptions and rupture, generations cut off. What is passed on to future generations is, I would like to suggest, in a long midrashic tradition of Jewish ritual and belief, is the story, the relevance of the story. Storytelling, as we know, is central to Judaism. The story has great efficacy. The story is what links memory, what connects generations. And early on in the graphic novel, Lemmelman draws this image of his mother on her gravestone. She's facing outward. Her hand is raised with finger beckoning, pointing toward her own image, pointing behind her, speaking from the grave, which is always a kind of unnerving experience for the recipient. But speaking from the grave, she calls to her son, "Listen to me, Matala," she insists. "Sometimes your memories are not your own." Indeed, I think they become part of the accumulation of another person's sorrow, an expression of collective mourning. Loss is evoked in a variety of ways in the graphic form as a metaphorical and literal trope of absence. In Lemmelman's graphic memoir, the unrepresentable casts a haunting shadow over the artist's efforts to bring back to life on the page the members of his extended family who were unknown to him, but those at the center of his mother's narrative, his mother's loss, a loss that he shares. And there's a stunning image I wanted to show you where Lemmelman draws his mother's family in Poland as they once might have been, as they sit around a table at mealtime. This is an ordinary domestic scene that implies, I think, the horror that is to come. As the mother says in the narrative that is in the text box, "So we eat for one last time in our house. I take the father's wine cup, I take some of the mother's needlework, and I take the photographs from our family." The second generation graphic artist here shows his mother's family dissolving, yet their traces remain. Here, Lemmelman graphically recreates absence. The family is severed, and Lemmelman shows them visually deconstructing on the page, visually portraying their erasure. And this image comes at a point in the book. This is a repetitive image. The first time we see it, the family is intact. It's early on, it's in their pre-war life. All the members are there sharing a meal. We see this again later in its form that we see here. And Lemmelman shows the family partially erased from the picture by the hand of the artist, which is his way of entering the text of the past, of entering the text of his mother's history. And the erasure marks, I think significantly, are in progress. The ghostly remains of the family are still partially visible. Although the image is a still, through these partial erasures, Lemmelman creates motion. This kind of lattice work of blotting out the figures creates movement achieved by the incompletion of the erased figures, but also by the jagged crisscrossing of the smudges made by the incompletion and made by the erasures. As the image bleeds out of the page, off the panel and off the page, we're witness to the family dissolving. We participate in their leave taking, in the erosion of the family. Through the partial erasures, we both see the soon to depart family and we do not see them. They are both there and no longer there. This simple act of the family gathered together in the familiarity of their home at mealtime, this simple ritual, as it is being erased, opens itself up to the larger scope of the atrocity. Because one of the challenges for not only graphic artists, but for Holocaust writers is, how do you get at individual family narratives and not lose the scope of the enormity of the Shoah? How do you do both? How does the one speak to the other? To the historical enormity of their times. And this image is both constructed and deconstructed simultaneously. In doing so, Lemmelmann blurs the past, present, and possible future. And we really see this here because on the far left corner of the image, which extends outside of the frame, the room is existing in their pre-war life. But on the other side, the drawing on the right side extends beyond its borders, suggesting a future of death. In this way, Lemmelmann represents, as I say, both presence and absence, and it evokes a line that haunts me from David Grossman, the Israeli novelist David Grossman, who wrote, "Books are the place in the world where both the thing and the loss of it can coexist." Where the thing and the loss of it can coexist. I now want to move, I want to run out of time, to a third generation graphic narrative by a grandchild of survivors. Amy Kurzweil's 2016 third generation graphic memoir, Flying Couch. It's an attempt, as she puts it, to construct a bridge between the real and the unimaginable. Flying Couch presents in comics form the story of Kurzweil's grandmother, who as an adolescent escaped the Warsaw Ghetto and spent the war in hiding in the Polish countryside, disguised as an Aryan, an orphan peasant girl, because she had blonde hair and blue eyes. And thus her life was spared fortuitously, while the lives of her grandmother, her parents, and her siblings were lost. Kurzweil's memoir, like Lemmelmann's, is an illustrated rendition of her grandmother's recorded oral testimony, a story whose telling Kurzweil will turn over to the survivor, whose authorizing gaze gives testimony to the events that she witnessed. But given the conventions of the graphic novel, the voices of granddaughter and grandmother both collide and harmonize, since the granddaughter narrates her grandmother's story as the grandmother tells it, providing both textual and visual clues to her testimony. And what this creates is a kind of doubling of voices, a doubling of vision, a way of seeing into the past. She too begins with a pre-war life of her grandmother in Poland, and her grandmother's narrative chronicles escalating anti-Semitic fervor, the Nazi occupation of Poland, hiding in fear with her family in a temporary bunker, their incarceration in the ghetto, the deaths of her younger sister and grandmother, and her eventual escape and flight, as she says, her worlds disappearing one by one. Kurzweil's purpose is in Deuteronomic tradition to memorialize her grandmother's history, to write and illustrate her life, polish and publish her history, immortalize it, fashion it into those stories to be imprinted upon our homes and on our gates as we lie down and as we rise up. One thing that we find over and over again, a characteristic of third generation writing, is to contextualize the narrative in a biblical Judaic past. And the Deuteronomic imperative to pass on the story, to pass on the memory to future generations, is often the frame for these narratives. And I think it's really important the way in which these very, very contemporary writers evoke the past, the actual historical past, a kind of legendary mythic past, a biblical past, a scriptural past, set against the contemporary, a contemporary post-Holocaust world. So Kurzweil's purpose then is to memorialize her grandmother's life, her grandmother's narrative. And as Kurzweil makes clear, the story of the Holocaust is ongoing, transferred to subsequent generations by the necessity to keep alive the memory of those who perished and those who survived, and by the anxious appropriation of fear, ill-defined, as she writes, black and scary, spreading into the future. The past exists, of course, in her grandmother's memories, but also in the traumatic imprint of the past, subsumed in the life of the survivor's granddaughter, who grew up under the shadow of that haunting past. Her sense of self and place is built on the stories and lives of those who came before, and whose experiences and stories shaped her own. Her grandmother's stories are her legacy, her inheritance. In fact, he's not a graphic artist, but I would really recommend the work of the Jewish Guatemalan American writer Eduardo Halfon, who's written a series of short interlocking short stories, who writes as the grandson of a survivor of Auschwitz, my grandfather's story is my patrimony. And you hear this refrain over and over and over again. And these are stories that tumble and spiral their way through the generations, as she writes and draws in this really wonderful image, I think. These are stories whose words shape, define, and give meaning to her own experience that, in fact, construct a house, the scaffolding of self and identity and place. And this graphic narrative is significantly, and we see this over and over again with third generation writing, an attempt to find her own place in that legacy. There is a memorable moment in this graphic narrative that I wanted to look at really quickly, where the autobiographical narrator, as a young child, is looking with startling and uncanny recognition into her grandmother's dark glasses. Now, reflected in her grandmother's dark glasses is not her own image, but rather the image of the great aunt who was killed, the great aunt she never knew, who died of starvation in the Warsaw Ghetto. Her grandmother's reflected lenses are windows of signification for the young narrator, who, in attempting to locate her place in the legacy of the Holocaust, finds her own image eclipsed, insubstantial against, and subsumed by the weight of history. Her own image is concealed by the traumatic past. It's eclipsed, as if a shade is drawn down, covering the present. The narrator loses herself in her grandmother's gaze as it's reflected back to her. At the same time, she sees herself in the image of the other, that is, the self she might have been, save for the accidents of birth. And we see this too in these graphic narratives. Writers and graphic artists who believe that, save for the accidents of birth and place and timing, they could have been there. I'm thinking, for example, of a really interesting graphic narrative by Joe Kubert called Yosel, and it's about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. But he places himself in that narrative. And this is an anxiety you see over and over again as well. But here, what we find when the granddaughter looks into her grandmother's glasses and sees the child who died, her traumatic history is imprinted on, seared on the lens of her memory and her vision. So what is it then that the grandmother sees when she looks at her grandchild? And what does the granddaughter see when she looks at her grandmother? They both see the past through the mediating lens of her grandmother's stories. And the survivor's granddaughter, in a moment, I think, of really uneasy identification, is transported to another time and place. And this is something that all these graphic novelists attempt to do, is to collapse time and space, to bring them together. We are in the present in this image, but we're also in the past simultaneously, which moves the granddaughter to the other side of her present circumstances. She carries the image, the memory, across generations. And I know I'm running out of time, and so I'll conclude very quickly. I just want to say that what I think this is doing is creating a material picture of witnessing, because what happens to witnessing now at a time that, again, we will see the end of eyewitness accounts? What does it mean for subsequent generations to bear witness to the Holocaust? And Kurzweil thus, I think, gives a face to history and to memory. Such visual metaphors that expose the hidden past evoke something concealed in the past, something dangerous and darkly buried. And what Kurzweil asks, what I think they all ask, is what is it we see when we look into the past, but what is reflected back to us? What are our ethical obligations and responsibilities? Another third generation novelist, Julie Oringer, who has written 2 novels based on her Hungarian grandparents' experience in the Holocaust. The first is The Invisible Bridge, which is a fabulous, they're both really fabulous novels, but her most recent one is called Flight Portfolio. And she writes in there are moments when the filament of time bends, loops, blurs. The present becomes permeable. The past leaps forward and insists itself upon us without warning. And for the descendants of survivors, personalized stories of past trauma reveal both the singular weight of devastating individual loss and also the extended, widening magnitude of such loss, its tentacles that reach into the future gaze, into subsequent generations. Generations who carry the memory of these events and become a crucial part of the narrative of the lives of post-Holocaust generations. Thank you. And I will stop sharing the screen.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. I do remember that Invisible Bridge book and really enjoyed it. And as a 3rd generation survivor myself, something you said really struck with me in terms of memory, that we all have our own experiences of memory. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more about that in some of the accounts that you've researched, how memory plays into the survivor's experience?
It's interesting to think about survivor narratives in this way, because memory and what we find in early survivor narratives, and I'm thinking of course, Elie Wiesel, but let's say Ida Fink, or famously Primo Levi, who wrote, these are memories that no one wants to carry, that no one wants to continually think about, but the memory has to be passed on to others so that we are faithful to history. And but memory is slippery, and as I say, memory is eroded by time, by the defenses, this kind of psychological defenses of sublimation, and when you move to the 2nd generation, so many 2nd generation writers, I'm thinking maybe of Thane Rosenbaum, who wrote Secondhand Smoke, or Melvin Bouquet, other 2nd generation writers, well, Art Spiegelman. What you find with the 2nd generation, they fall into a couple of different categories. Either children of survivors whose parents refused to talk about it, and children of survivors whose parents talked about it all the time. In both cases, they're protective impulses, right? How to protect your children. Do you want to shield your children from the reality of the atrocities? Do you want to protect them? I mean, there's a story, several stories that Thane Rosenbaum writes in a collection I would really recommend called Elijah Visible. It's a collection of interlocking stories, but in each story, the central character, Adam Posner, has the same name, but in every story, he's a different age, he has a different occupation, but there's one thing that links him through all the stories, and that is that he's a child of survivors, and whose parents will tell him the story of their experience just in case. And then with the third generation, and I mean, I think this is it's a long way to answer your question, I'm sorry, but I just want to say this: with the third generation, I mean, this is true anyway, very often the relation of children, grandchildren and grandparents is, I don't want to say closer than children and their parents, but it's less fraught in many ways. And what you find is that the third generation seeks out the stories of grandparents who in many cases are more willing to tell the stories to the grandchildren than they were to their own children. I'm a judge for the Edward Lewis Wallant Award, which is an award given every year to a relatively unknown rising Jewish writer. And it's named for Edward Lewis Wallant, of course, who famously wrote The Pawnbroker and who died very early in his life, in his 30s. But the award is still being given in his honor. And I'm telling you this because with Julie Oranger, the third generation graphic novelist of Invisible Bridge and The Flight Portfolio, when she came, and when we have the presentation, it's sponsored by the University of Hartford, because the donors live in West Hartford. But when she came to give her talk and to receive the award, her parents were in the audience and her grandmother, who was still surviving after she'd written this. And it was just this amazing experience, because her mother afterwards said to me, "I never knew any of these stories. My mother did not tell me." But of course, she told her granddaughter. Miriam?
Oh, go ahead. No, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, so it's how do we transfer memory? And I keep coming back to Deuteronomy, to the imperative, to what we do every year at Passover, that not only do we extend the memory, but it's as if we were witness to it.
So what I wanted to say is how important stories are to be passed down. I once I heard a lecture about the untold stories and the damage of a child growing up knowing something's missing. I think Letty Pagray wrote about this in one of her memoirs, about not knowing that there was a child that died before she was born, and the damage it did to not know that she was living with a ghost. The untold stories drive your life, and I had a personal experience on that. By not knowing the whole story, even if you just know part of it, you are doomed in ways that it's hard to understand the way that your life and your decisions take you without knowing. And I can see how by dredging this up and even imagining it by third generation artists, that they are cleansing that doom in some way.
I didn't talk about this graphic narrative, but this is something that made me think of when you were saying that is I found so disturbing and so fascinating. There's a recent graphic narrative that I've been thinking about alongside somebody like Amy Kurzweil's third generation survivor narrative. It's called Belonging, and it's written and drawn by Nora Krug, who's the grandchild of Nazi perpetrators.
Ah.
And this just came out in 2018, I think. And it's her attempt. It's a very interesting profile. She no longer lives in Germany. She lives in New York, and she's married into a Jewish family. And it's only now that she has gone back to Germany to find out the truth around the silence. That's what made me think of it, that her parents never, her grandparents, whom she knew, never talked about their lives as adults under National Socialism, living in Germany. And so she goes back to unearth the past against this veil of silence, the shroud of silence. And what she finds, of course, disturbingly, is that both her maternal and paternal grandparents were Nazis. Oh. And her parents, who were born right at the end of the war, I think they were born in 45 or maybe 46, grew up at a time in Germany where no one was talking about this. So they had no idea, they suspected. But so I've been rereading a lot of the current works by the grandchildren of survivors to look at next to these return narratives that are, as you might imagine, very fraught. And there are not a lot of them, but at this moment in history, we are finding an increase in the number of grandchildren of perpetrators who are starting to attempt to come to terms with the past.
Fascinating. If anybody else has any other questions, you can either raise your hand or just speak, or you can type it in the chat. We'd love to, I think we have time for one or two more questions. As those are coming in, I also want to ask about, you mentioned Art Spiegelman, and I recall the Mouse books when I was growing up reading them. Can you compare sort of that genre from his writings to maybe what more recent graphic narratives are today? And also how, when you think of graphic novels, you don't necessarily, you think of comic books, you think of the youth engaging with them. To what extent is that genre really growing for adults?
The genre has changed dramatically. And, I come to this really kind of out of the blue. I was not a kid who grew up reading comics. I never read comics. And the way I started doing this is that I teach every semester at Trinity Literature of the Holocaust class. And for years I try to make it multi-generic. So I introduce poetry because one thing I want my students to come to recognize is that there are many forms, many modes of representation. So we have poetry, short stories, essays, and I always included Spiegelman's Mouse. And the genre of comics narratives has changed so dramatically since Spiegelman first started publishing Mouse in Raw magazine in the late 70s. And Raw magazine was an underground comics magazine. It's now mainstream. But I would make the distinction between sort of comics narratives like, I don't know, the Magna and various comics, and the genre now, the recognized genre of the graphic narrative, which is a genre that deals with serious topics. And we really, it's a 21st century phenomenon. This is the genre of our time right now. I think no surprise because of the focus on the visual in our culture. But back to Spiegelman, all these graphic artists attribute their work to Spiegelman. All of them say that Spiegelman started everything. In fact, Miriam Caton, the author of We're on Our Own, the graphic artist, said that Spiegelman's mouse legitimized the genre, gave her permission, is how she put it, to tell her family's story. So, I mean, he really changed the scope of the genre.
Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ahrens. Final question about the work of Irina Klepfitz, Miriam was asking. And what can you share about her work?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly recommend. What have you read by her, Miriam?
Everything, all of her early stuff. I knew her. I was active in National Women's Studies Association, and she was part of the Jewish caucus. And I was writing book reviews at the time, and I reviewed Tribe of Dinah, and I found all of these Jewish women writers in that collection. And her work is amazing. I mean, and she survived with her mother because they had blue eyes and because her mother could speak Polish like a Polish person. And that, she said, that saved them. But she saw, they were in the Warsaw Ghetto, and she saw her father lying dead as part of he was one of the leaders in the uprising. And they left at that point without him. And it was just the two of them. And she's in her, I think she's about 79 now. But I love her work. There's a very hidden kind of humor, and I think she's teaching at Barnard now. She sort of drifted around. Her work is profound to me. I
think you're right. And it's only recently that women survivors writing has gotten the attention that I think it deserves. I mean, historically, of course, it was the male writers, Elie Wiesel, Primo Levi. But now, I mean, Klepfish, Eva Hoffman, Ida Fink, Charlotte Delbo, and now more and more women are sort of moving into the foreground of Holocaust studies. Well, there's a question in the chat. I did want to say something really quickly about the definition of survivor. We tend to use that definition, extend that definition, and I think that's important. That a survivor is not only someone who survived the concentration camps or survived the ghetto, but also a survivor who was someone who escaped, someone who was in hiding, someone who was in hiding in the countryside. Survivor, the definition of survivor has also been extended to include refugees who escaped in the nick of time. And I think that is an important definition, an extension of the definition, especially because there's so many refugees, so many people who did get out at the nick of time, but who were subjected to Nazism, who were subjected to persecution, and who were subjected to anti-Semitic laws and legislation, and they too survived the Nazi onslaught. Wow, fascinating. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Ahrens, for all of your knowledge and your passion. This was fantastic. Really, thank you for inviting me to talk about my favorite subject. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Miriam, for helping put this together on behalf of the committee. And again, thank you for all of you for joining us. A couple of notes to look ahead. On Sunday morning at 11 a.m., we'll be welcoming Rabbi Josh Herman from Israel, who will be joining us again as he talks about the Reform movement in Israel and his experience making Aliyah to Israel and what Tu B'Shvat is like in Israel these days. So
please join us for that online at 11 a.m. on Sunday. Our next monthly Midrash session will be on February 11th with Josh Furman from our community. So we've got Josh Herman and Josh Furman. So those are coming up, and Josh Furman is our historian of the Jewish community here in Houston. Will be sharing his insights and his experience in the archives as an archivist, and the history of Beth Israel and some of our prominent families too from our history. Finally, this Tuesday night at 7 o'clock, Rabbi Lyon will be doing his second part of his prophets class as well. The first part was last night on Wednesday, and then the second part will be this Wednesday on the 27th. Please join us. I think I said Tuesday, Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. The first part is recorded. If you didn't get it, it's on YouTube. It's on our website as well. So lots to look forward to going forward. Miriam, you have a note? And
this is recorded, so
yes.
I have already. I'm going to be sending it to some friends that didn't make it, but do send this out. It's
absolutely.
So, and you just did such a beautiful job, as I knew you would. So thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's just really a pleasure to talk to people who are interested in the continuing story of the Holocaust.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Stay well, stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.